Millionaire woman made her black maid eat on the floor. But what happened next silenced everyone. The crystal chandelier above the dining table cast dancing shadows across the white marble floor. 68-year-old Grace Williams stood perfectly still in the corner of the room, her worn hands clutching a silver tray that had become too heavy after 3 hours of serving. Her dark skin glistened with sweat beneath the starched gray uniform that Mrs. Victoria Ashford insisted all her staff wear, complete with a white apron that had to be spotless at all times. "Grace, you're standing there like a statue again." Victoria's voice cut through the elegant dinner conversation like a knife. "If you're not serving, you shouldn't be visible." The 12 guests around the table fell silent, their forks suspended in midair. Grace had worked for the Ashford family for 42 years since she was 26, fresh from the South with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. She had raised Victoria's children, nursed Victoria's mother through her final days, and kept this mansion running through 2 generations. But in Victoria's eyes, she remained what she had always been, the help. "Yes, ma'am," Grace whispered, backing toward the kitchen door. "Wait." Victoria's perfectly manicured hand rose in the air. "Before you go, I noticed you took a plate of food earlier. Where exactly were you planning to eat that?" Grace's heart dropped. "In the kitchen, ma'am, as always." Victoria stood up, her designer dress rustling as she moved. At 55, she was the picture of wealth and privilege, blonde hair styled weekly at the most expensive salon in town, diamonds on every finger, and a smile that never quite reached her cold blue eyes. "That won't do," Victoria said, walking slowly around the table. "You see, my guests tonight are very important people. The Hendersons, the Crawfords, the Montgomerys. They're investing in my new charity foundation." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "A foundation for underprivileged children, actually. Isn't that wonderful?" A few guests nodded uncomfortably. Grace noticed Mrs. Henderson, an older woman with kind eyes, looking down at her plate. "But here's the thing, Grace," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a theatrical quality. "I can't have my staff eating at the kitchen table. It's unhygienic. Food particles, you understand. And the kitchen chairs? Those are antiques, worth more than—" She trailed off, letting the implication settle. "Well, you understand." Grace felt her hands begin to tremble. In 42 years, she had eaten at that same kitchen table. The same worn chair in the corner overlooking the garden she had planted with her own hands. "So, I've decided," Victoria announced, as if revealing a great solution. "From now on, you'll take your meals on the floor, in the corner, by the pantry. I'll have someone bring you a cushion. You should be grateful, actually. Many households don't feed their staff at all." The silence that followed was suffocating. Grace felt every eye in the room upon her. Some looked away in shame. Others watched with morbid curiosity, waiting to see what the old black woman would do. "Mrs. Ashford," Grace's voice came out barely above a whisper, "I've worked for your family since before you were married. I've never asked for anything beyond my wages and a place to rest my head." "And you've been generously compensated," Victoria interrupted. "This isn't a negotiation, Grace. This is how things will be. Now, if you're hungry, you know where your place is." Grace looked at the plate in her hands. Leftover chicken and vegetables, simple food she had prepared herself. Her knees, worn from decades of scrubbing floors and climbing stairs, ached at the thought of lowering herself to the ground like an animal. But it was the laughter that broke her. Victoria's tinkling, performative laugh, joined hesitantly by a few guests who didn't know where else to look. "Go on then?" Victoria gestured dismissively. "We're waiting." Grace walked slowly toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the marble. Behind her, she heard Victoria resume her conversation about the charity foundation, about helping those less fortunate, about the importance of dignity and education for all children. The hypocrisy burned like acid in Grace's chest. In the kitchen, Grace stood alone. The plate shook in her hands. She looked at the corner by the pantry, that dark space where Victoria expected her to crouch and eat like a dog. 42 years of service, of sacrifice, of putting this family's needs before her own, and this was her reward. Grace set the plate down on the counter. She untied her apron slowly, her fingers working the knot with deliberate care. Then she folded it, placed it neatly beside the plate, and removed the gray uniform jacket. Underneath, she wore a simple blue dress, faded but clean. It was the dress she wore to church every Sunday, the only day Victoria allowed her off. The dress her late husband Samuel had bought her 30 years ago, before the cancer took him. Grace walked to the small closet where she kept her personal belongings. From the top shelf, hidden behind cleaning supplies, she pulled down an old leather satchel. Inside were documents she had collected over 4 decades. Letters, photographs, receipts, and records that told a very different story of the Ashford family than the one Victoria presented to the world. Her hands no longer trembled. Instead, a strange calm settled over her, the kind of peace that comes when a person finally decides they've had enough. She heard footsteps behind her. Mrs. Henderson stood in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Grace, I'm so sorry," the older woman whispered. "What Victoria did was inexcusable. I want you to know that not everyone at that table agrees with her behavior." Grace smiled sadly. "But no one spoke up, did they, Mrs. Henderson?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "No, we didn't. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. It's not your burden to carry," Grace said gently. She had learned long ago that white guilt changed nothing unless it was accompanied by action. "But I appreciate your kindness." Mrs. Henderson glanced back toward the dining room, then pulled an envelope from her purse. "This is my personal card. If you need anything, a reference, help finding a new position, anything at all, please call me." Grace accepted the card, tucking it into her satchel. "Thank you." As Mrs. Henderson returned to the dining room, Grace took one last look around the kitchen that had been her domain for most of her adult life. She knew every corner, every cabinet, every crack in the tile. She had cooked thousands of meals here, had hummed hymns while washing dishes, had sneaked cookies to Victoria's children when they were small and sweet, before their mother's poison had seeped into them. She thought of Samuel, who had worked as a driver for the Ashfords until his illness. She thought of her daughter Maria, who had grown up in the servants' quarters of this house, watching her mother work 18-hour days. Maria was a doctor now, living 3 states away, constantly begging her mother to retire to come live with her. "Maybe it's time, Samuel," Grace whispered to the memory of her husband. "Maybe it's finally time." She picked up her satchel and walked toward the back door. But before leaving, she did something she had never done in 42 years of service. She walked back through the kitchen, through the hallway, and stood at the entrance to the dining room. Victoria was holding court, describing her vision for the charity foundation. "We must teach these children that hard work and respect are the keys to success," she was saying. "That's what's wrong with society today. No one understands the value of knowing one's place." "Mrs. Ashford?" Grace's voice rang clear and strong across the room. Every head turned. Victoria's face darkened with anger. "I told you to—" "I'm leaving," Grace interrupted. For the first time in 4 decades, she interrupted her employer. "I won't be eating on your floor. I won't be eating in your kitchen. I won't be in your house at all." Victoria stood up, her face reddening. "You can't just leave. You have responsibilities. I need you for the foundation gala next week." Grace smiled, and it was not a bitter smile, but one of profound relief. "You'll have to find someone else to humiliate." "How dare you?" Victoria's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "After everything I've done for you, I gave you a job when no one else would. I kept you on even when you were slow, even when you made mistakes. This is how you repay me? Everything you've done for me?" Grace's voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that made even Victoria pause. "Mrs. Ashford, I have worked for your family since 1981. I was paid $4 an hour for the first 10 years. Minimum wage was higher, but you said room and board made up the difference. That room was an 8x10 space with no heat in winter. That board was leftovers." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I raised your children while you traveled. Grace continued. I nursed your mother, changing her diapers and reading to her every night for 2 years. When your father had his stroke, I slept in a chair beside his bed for 6 months. And when your son Michael got into that trouble in college, the trouble that would have ruined his future, I was the one who— That's enough. Victoria's hand slammed on the table, rattling the china. Get out. Get out of my house right now, and don't expect any references. I'll make sure no one in this city ever hires you again. Grace nodded slowly. I expected as much. She turned to leave. But Mr. Crawford, a distinguished man in his 70s who had been silent throughout the dinner, suddenly spoke. Mrs. Williams, wait please. Grace paused. Mr. Crawford stood up, wiping his mouth with his napkin. Victoria, I've known your family for 30 years. I knew your father quite well, actually. He looked at Grace with newfound interest. You said you were there during Harold's stroke, that you cared for him? Every day for 6 months, sir, Grace confirmed. Did he ever speak to you about his business affairs? His will, perhaps? Victoria's face went pale. Charles, this is hardly the time. I ask, Mr. Crawford continued, ignoring Victoria. Because Harold was my law partner. He handled his personal affairs himself, but he did mention something curious to me a few weeks before he died. He said he had made provisions for someone who had shown him true loyalty, someone who had earned more than wages. The room fell absolutely silent. Grace felt her heart begin to race. That's ridiculous, Victoria sputtered. My father left everything to me. The will was very clear. The will was clear, Mr. Crawford agreed. But Harold also established several trusts, private ones. I only learned of them after his death, and by then the paperwork had been sealed. Harold could be quite secretive about such things. He turned to Grace. Mrs. Williams, have you ever received any correspondence from a law firm called Brighton and Associates? Grace's hands tightened on her satchel. Inside, buried among the other papers, was an unopened letter that had arrived 3 months ago. She had been too afraid to open it, too worn down by years of service to believe anything good could come in an official envelope. I may have, she admitted quietly. Victoria's face transformed from anger to something else entirely. Fear. I think, Mr. Crawford said carefully, that you should open that letter, Mrs. Williams, and I think you should do it with a lawyer present. If you'd like, I'd be happy to represent you. Pro bono, of course. This is my house. Victoria's voice cracked. You're all my guests. How dare you turn against me for some ungrateful servant who has endured your cruelty with more grace than you deserve? Mrs. Henderson finished quietly, standing up. I'm leaving, Victoria. I won't be part of your charity foundation, and I certainly won't sit here and watch you destroy a woman who has given you 42 years of her life. One by one, the other guests stood. Some avoided Victoria's eyes. Others stared at her with open disgust. Within 5 minutes, the dining room was empty except for Victoria, her husband Robert, who had watched the entire scene in stunned silence, and Grace, still standing in the doorway with her worn satchel. You've ruined me, Victoria whispered, tears of rage streaming down her face. You've turned everyone against me. Grace shook her head slowly. No, Mrs. Ashford, I didn't ruin you. You did that yourself. As Grace walked out the back door into the cool evening air, she heard Victoria's sobs echoing through the mansion. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a profound exhaustion and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. In her satchel, the unopened letter from Brighton and Associates seemed to pulse with possibility. Tomorrow she would call Mr. Crawford. Tomorrow she would open that letter. Tomorrow her life might change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Grace Williams walked away from the Ashford mansion with her dignity intact, her head held high, and the certain knowledge that she would never, ever eat on anyone's floor. The night was clear, and the stars seemed brighter than they had in years. Grace sat in the small waiting room of Crawford and Associates, her hands folded in her lap, the unopened letter resting on top of her worn Bible. She had spent the night at a modest motel, the first time in 42 years she had slept somewhere other than the servants' quarters of the Ashford mansion. The bed had been too soft, the silence too loud, and she had barely slept at all. Mr. Charles Crawford arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, dressed in an impeccable gray suit. Despite his wealth and status, he greeted her with genuine warmth, shaking her hand and guiding her to his private office. "Mrs. Williams," he began, settling into the chair across from her rather than behind his imposing desk, "I want you to know that what happened last night was unconscionable. Victoria Ashford should be ashamed of herself." Grace nodded, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that words of sympathy from wealthy white people often evaporated when it came time for action. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Crawford continued, "I'm not here to offer you sympathy, Mrs. Williams. I'm here to ensure you receive what is rightfully yours. Harold Ashford was my friend and partner for 30 years. He was a complicated man, often difficult, but in his final months, he experienced something of a spiritual awakening. Your care for him during that time affected him profoundly." He gestured to the letter. "May I?" Grace handed it to him with trembling fingers. Mr. Crawford opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. His eyebrows rose, and he let out a long, slow breath. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, "did you know that Harold owned property beyond the mansion?" "I knew he had business investments, sir, but the family affairs were never discussed with me." Mr. Crawford nodded, reading further. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Respect, perhaps, or wonder. "Harold Ashford established a trust in your name 23 years ago," he said carefully. "After his wife passed away and you cared for him through his grief, he added to it regularly, particularly during the final 6 months of his life when you nursed him through his stroke." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. "I don't understand, sir." "The trust contains 3 properties, a 4-bedroom house in the Riverside district, a small commercial building currently leased to a bookstore and cafe, and a lakefront cabin in the mountains. There's also a substantial cash sum." He paused, watching her face. "Mrs. Williams, the total value of your inheritance is approximately $2.3 million. The room tilted. Grace gripped the arms of her chair, certain she had misheard. "That can't be right." "It's quite right. Harold stipulated that the trust would remain sealed until either your 65th birthday or your departure from the Ashford household, whichever came first. You turned 68 3 months ago. The letter was automatically sent, but apparently you never opened it." Grace thought of that letter sitting in her small room, buried under years of fear and exhaustion. She had been too tired, too beaten down by life to believe anything good could find her there. But Mrs. Ashford, "Victoria, she never mentioned—" "Victoria doesn't know," Mr. Crawford said firmly. "Harold kept this completely private. He told me, shortly before he died, that Victoria had become someone he didn't recognize, someone cruel and cold. He said you had shown him more kindness in 6 months than his own daughter had shown him in a lifetime." Tears began to roll down Grace's weathered cheeks. Not tears of joy, not yet, but tears of something deeper. Validation, recognition, proof that her life of service had been seen, had mattered to someone. "There's more," Mr. Crawford continued gently. "Harold left a letter for you, a personal one. It was included in the trust documents." He pulled out a yellowed envelope, Harold Ashford's distinctive handwriting across the front. "For Grace Williams, who taught me what true dignity looks like." Grace's hands shook as she opened it. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Harold's death. "Dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I am gone and you are finally free from my daughter's house. I pray you left on your own terms, with your head high, though knowing Victoria, I suspect she made it difficult. I have spent my life accumulating wealth and power. I built an empire, as they say. But in my final months trapped in this failing body, I learned that I had built it on sand. The only real thing, the only genuine human connection I had, came from you. You changed my diapers when I had lost control of my body, You read to me when I could no longer hold a book. You prayed over me when I was too proud to pray for myself. You treated me with dignity when I had none left. My daughter sees you as beneath her. My grandchildren have been taught to look through you, as if you were invisible. But Grace, you are the only one in my family who understood what it means to be truly human. This trust is not charity. It is not payment. It is an attempt, however feeble, to restore some balance to a universe I helped make unequal. You gave me 42 years of your life. I am giving you what freedom I can purchase. Use this gift to rest, to live, to be seen. You have earned every penny and more. With profound gratitude and respect, Harold Ashford Grace read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely now. Mr. Crawford discreetly offered her a box of tissues and stepped out of the office to give her privacy. When he returned 20 minutes later, Grace had composed herself. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. Mr. Crawford, I need to ask you something. Anything. Is this real? Can Victoria take this away from me? Can she claim I manipulated her father or challenge the trust? Mr. Crawford shook his head firmly. Harold was of completely sound mind when he created this trust. I have medical records, witness statements, and ironclad legal documentation. Victoria cannot touch this. It is yours, free and clear. Grace closed her eyes, letting the reality sink in. She was free. After 68 years of struggle, of working multiple jobs, of scraping by, of accepting humiliation because she had no choice, she was finally free. What happens now? She asked. Now, Mr. Crawford smiled. You decide how you want to live your life. The house in Riverside is vacant and ready for you to move in whenever you'd like. The rental income from the commercial property is approximately $4,000 per month, and the cash sum is in a trust account, earning interest. Grace sat in silence for a long moment. Then she asked, Mr. Crawford, what will happen to Victoria? The lawyer's expression hardened. Why do you ask? Because I've known that family for 42 years. I know things that never appeared in any legal documents, things that might interest certain authorities. Mr. Crawford leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of things? Grace opened her old satchel and pulled out folders she had carefully maintained over the decades. I have records of financial transactions Victoria forced me to witness and sign. Money moved from her father's accounts to offshore holdings while he was incapacitated. I have photographs of documents she had me shred, but I kept copies of first. I have recordings. Recordings? Mrs. Ashford never noticed that the old intercom system in the servants' quarters still worked. For the last 5 years, every conversation in her study was audible in my room. I recorded many of them. Grace's voice was calm, factual. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for protection. I knew one day she might try to accuse me of theft or fraud. I wanted evidence of my innocence. Mr. Crawford's eyes widened as he examined the documents, bank statements, signed papers, photographs of Victoria's handwritten notes about tax evasion schemes. And most damning of all, recorded conversations discussing insurance fraud, bribery of city officials, and the systematic exploitation of undocumented workers. Mrs. Williams, he said slowly, do you understand what you have here? Evidence of crimes, I believe. Not just crimes. This could bring down Victoria's entire operation. The charity foundation she's starting, according to these documents, it's a tax shelter designed to hide family money. The city contracts her husband's construction company keeps winning. There's clear evidence of bribes. The workers they've employed over the years? Many were paid below minimum wage and threatened with deportation if they complained. Grace nodded. I know. I was there for all of it. Why didn't you come forward before? Grace gave him a look that conveyed decades of weary knowledge. Mr. Crawford, I'm a 68-year-old black woman with no formal education beyond high school. Victoria is a wealthy white woman with connections to every powerful person in this city. Who do you think they would have believed? The lawyer had the grace to look ashamed. You're right. I apologize for the naive question. But now, Grace continued, I have resources. I have a good lawyer. She offered him a small smile. and I have nothing left to lose. What do you want to do with this information? Grace thought for a long moment. She thought of all the people Victoria had hurt over the years. The workers cheated out of fair wages, the families separated by threats of deportation, the small businesses Victoria's husband had crushed to win contracts, the children who would suffer if that fraudulent charity foundation moved forward. I want justice, Grace said simply. Not revenge, justice. There's a difference? Revenge is about hurting someone because they hurt you. Justice is about preventing them from hurting anyone else. Mr. Crawford smiled, a genuine expression of admiration. Mrs. Williams, I think you might be the wisest person I've ever met. I'm just tired of watching bad people win, Mr. Crawford. Over the next 3 hours, they built a strategy. Mr. Crawford would quietly contact the district attorney's office, the IRS, and the state labor board. The evidence would be presented methodically through proper channels. Grace would be protected as a whistleblower under state law. This will take time, Mr. Crawford warned. Weeks, possibly months. And Victoria will fight. She'll hire expensive lawyers, call in favors, try to destroy your credibility. Let her try, Grace said with quiet confidence. I have the truth, and now I have the resources to make sure the truth is heard. As Grace prepared to leave, Mr. Crawford asked one more question. What will you do while we wait for the investigation to proceed? Where will you go? Grace thought of the house in Riverside that now belonged to her. A real house, not a servant's quarters. She thought of her daughter, Maria, who had been begging her to visit for years. She thought of the church she had attended faithfully for 4 decades, always sitting in the back, always leaving before the social hour because she had to return to work. I'm going to rest, Grace said. For the first time in my adult life, I'm going to rest. She walked out of the law office into the bright morning sunlight. The city looked different somehow. The same buildings, the same streets, but transformed by possibility. Grace hailed a taxi, something she had never done before, always taking the bus to save money. She gave the driver the address in Riverside, her address now, and settled into the back seat. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Grace noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. Victoria Ashford, still in yesterday's clothes, her makeup smeared, staring at the law office with an expression of growing panic. Their eyes met through the taxi window. Grace didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't gesture. She simply looked at Victoria the way one might look at a stranger on the street with neutral disinterest, and then she looked away. It was that moment, more than anything else, that Grace knew had truly changed. She was no longer the woman who lived in fear of Victoria's moods and power. She was no longer anyone's servant. She was Grace Williams, homeowner, woman of independent means, and bearer of evidence that would soon shake the foundations of the Ashford Empire. The taxi drove through the city, past the mansion where Grace had spent 4 decades of her life, past the church where she had prayed for strength every Sunday, past the bus stops where she had waited in rain and snow to get to her other jobs. And finally, they arrived at Riverside. The neighborhood was beautiful. Tree-lined streets with well-maintained homes. The taxi pulled up to a modest but charming house with a white picket fence, a front porch with a swing, and a small garden already blooming with spring flowers. "This is it?" Grace asked, almost disbelieving. "This is the address you gave me, ma'am," the driver confirmed. Grace paid him with money from the account Mr. Crawford had given her access to. She walked up the front path, her satchel over her shoulder, and unlocked the door with the key that had been in the envelope. The house was furnished simply but comfortably. Sunlight streamed through clean windows. The kitchen was small but modern. The bedroom had a real bed, a queen-size bed with a thick mattress and clean white sheets. Grace walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, opening cabinets, looking out windows. In the bathroom, she found thick towels and soap that smelled like lavender. In the living room, someone had left fresh flowers on the coffee table, and a note. "Mrs. Williams, welcome home. The house has been maintained and prepared for your arrival. All utilities are connected and paid through the end of the year. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." Brighton and Associates. Grace sat down on the comfortable couch, still not quite able to believe this was real. She pulled out her cell phone, the cheap, prepaid phone she had saved for months to buy, and dialed her daughter's number. "Mama?" Maria's voice was worried. "Are you okay? You never call during the day." "Baby," Grace said, her voice breaking, "I have so much to tell you." As Grace recounted the events of the past 24 hours, she heard her daughter's reaction shift from shock to anger to tearful joy. "Mama, you're really free? You're really out of that house?" "I'm home, baby. I'm in my own home." Maria was crying now. "I'm coming to see you. I'm taking time off work, and I'm coming right now." "You don't have to. Mama, you spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Now it's time for someone to take care of you. I'm coming, and I'm not taking no for an answer." After they hung up, Grace sat in the quiet house and let herself cry. Not tears of sadness, but of release. 42 years of held breath, finally exhaled. She walked to the bedroom, lay down on that soft bed, and for the first time in decades, she slept in the middle of the day. Not because she was exhausted from work, but because she could. Because this was her home, her bed, her life. And outside, unknown to Grace, the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Mr. Crawford had already made his first calls. Investigators were beginning to look into the Ashford family business dealings. The carefully constructed facade of respectability was starting to crack. Victoria Ashford's world was about to come crashing down, brought down not by violence or vengeance, but by the quiet courage of a woman who had decided she deserved better. The woman she had ordered to eat on the floor was about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her life, that dignity cannot be purchased, but its absence can cost you everything. 3 weeks had passed since Grace Williams walked out of the Ashford mansion. In that time, her life had transformed in ways both small and profound. Her daughter Maria had stayed for 10 days, filling the house with laughter and cooking meals in a kitchen that now belonged to them. Together, they had shopped for new clothes, not the gray uniforms Grace had worn for decades, but soft sweaters in colors she loved, comfortable shoes, a warm coat for the coming winter. Grace had also begun attending a new church, one closer to her riverside home. On her first Sunday, she had walked through the front doors and, for the first time in her life, sat in the middle of the congregation, not in the back. When the pastor asked if there were any visitors, Grace had stood and introduced herself. The warmth of the welcome had brought tears to her eyes. But beneath this peaceful new life, storm clouds were gathering over the Ashford family. Charles Crawford called Grace on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to come to my office this afternoon. The district attorney wants to meet with you." Grace's heart quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Of course. What time?" 2 o'clock. "And Grace, wear whatever makes you feel strongest. This meeting matters." At exactly 2 o'clock, Grace entered Crawford's office wearing a burgundy dress Maria had helped her pick out, pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had nothing left to fear. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with a reputation for taking down white-collar criminals. She stood when Grace entered, extending her hand with genuine respect. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for coming. I've spent the last 3 weeks reviewing the evidence you provided through Mr. Crawford. What you've documented is extraordinary." They sat around Crawford's conference table, and Martinez spread out documents, photographs, and transcripts of the recordings Grace had made. "I want to be clear about what we're looking at here," Martinez began. "The Ashford family has been operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise for at least 15 years, possibly longer. Tax fraud, insurance fraud, labor exploitation, bribery of public officials, and money laundering through the proposed charity foundation." Grace listened quietly as Martinez detailed each charge. The weight of it all was staggering. Victoria and her husband Robert faced potential prison sentences. Their assets would be frozen pending investigation. The charity foundation launch had been halted. "Mrs. Williams," Martinez continued, "your testimony will be crucial. The defense attorneys will try to discredit you. They'll bring up your lack of formal education, your position as a domestic worker, your race. They'll suggest you had a grudge, that you fabricated evidence, that you're trying to extort the family. Let them try, Grace said calmly. I have the truth. Martinez smiled. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. But I need to prepare you for what's coming. This is going to be very public. The Ashford name carries weight in this city. When we file charges, it will be front-page news. I understand. Do you? Because once this breaks, your life will change. Reporters will want interviews. People will recognize you on the street. Some will call you a hero. Others will call you worse things. Are you ready for that? Grace thought of that night in the dining room, kneeling on the floor with a plate of food. She thought of 42 years of being invisible, of watching the Ashford family grow rich while paying her poverty wages, of every small humiliation she had endured in silence. Ms. Martinez, I've been invisible my whole life. If being visible means stopping them from hurting more people, then yes, I'm ready. The district attorney nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. Then let's bring them down. The news broke on a Friday morning. The headline in the city's major newspaper read, Ashford family empire built on fraud and exploitation. Former maid provides damning evidence. Grace's photograph appeared beside the article, a dignified image taken specifically for this purpose. The story detailed the charges, the evidence, and Grace's role in bringing the crimes to light. The reporter had interviewed Charles Crawford, who spoke eloquently about Grace's courage and integrity. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, Grace's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests. She declined them all, following Crawford's advice to let the evidence speak for itself. But she couldn't avoid the reaction of her community. That Sunday, when Grace arrived at church, she found the parking lot full of news vans. Reporters called out questions as she walked toward the entrance. Church members formed a protective circle around her, blocking the cameras and guiding her inside. Pastor Williams, no relation though they shared a last name, addressed the situation during his sermon. We have among us today a sister who has shown us what courage looks like. Not the loud courage of confrontation, but the quiet courage of standing up for what's right when everything in society told her to stay silent. The congregation erupted in applause. Grace, sitting in her usual middle pew, felt tears stream down her face. For the first time in her life, she was not just seen, she was celebrated. After the service, dozens of people waited to speak with her. Some shared their own stories of exploitation and discrimination. Others simply wanted to shake her hand. An elderly white woman approached with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Williams, my name is Dorothy Henderson. We met briefly at the Ashford dinner party. Grace recognized her immediately. Mrs. Henderson, you were kind to me that night. Not kind enough, Dorothy said, her voice breaking. I've replayed that evening in my mind 1,000 times. I should have stood up for you immediately. I should have walked out with you. Instead, I sat there like a coward. Grace took the older woman's hands in hers. You gave me your card. You offered help. That wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough. But I want you to know that I've already given a statement to the district attorney about what I witnessed that night, about how Victoria treated you, about the things I heard her say over the years. I may not have had courage then, but I'm trying to find it now. Grace squeezed her hands gently. It's never too late to do the right thing. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Other former Ashford employees started coming forward. A landscaper who had been paid under minimum wage, a construction worker who had been injured on an Ashford job site and denied workers' compensation, a housekeeper who had been fired when she became pregnant, told she was too unsightly to work in the mansion. One by one, they added their voices to Grace's. The case against the Ashford family grew stronger with each testimony. Charles Crawford called Grace with an update. Victoria's lawyers are trying to negotiate a plea deal. They want to avoid a trial. What does the district attorney say? She's considering it, but only if the terms are severe enough. Prison time, complete restitution to all victims, forfeiture of assets gained through illegal means, and a lifetime ban from operating any charitable organizations. Grace was quiet for a moment. And if they don't take the plea? Then we go to trial. It could take a year, maybe longer. And Grace, I need to be honest with you, it will be brutal. The defense will try to destroy your character. They'll dig into every aspect of your life looking for ammunition. Let them dig, Grace said. I have nothing to hide. But the stress was taking its toll. Despite the peace of her new home, despite the support of her daughter and her church community, Grace found herself exhausted. The weight of being a public figure, of representing not just herself but all the workers who had been exploited by powerful families like the Ashfords, was enormous. One evening, sitting on her front porch swing as the sun set, Grace called Maria. "Baby, I'm tired," she admitted. Not physically tired, soul tired. "Mama, you can stop this anytime you want. You've already done so much. If the trial is too much, no one would blame you for stepping back." Grace rocked slowly on the swing, considering her daughter's words. "You know what your daddy used to say? He'd say, 'Grace, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to get tired and go home.'" Maria laughed through her tears. "That sounds like Dad. I can't go home, baby. Not until this is finished. Not while Victoria is still out there, still able to hurt people. Then I'm coming back. You shouldn't have to face this alone. You have your own life, your practice, your patience, and you're my mama. My patients will understand. I'm coming and we're going to see this through together." True to her word, Maria arrived the following weekend. She set up a temporary office in Grace's spare bedroom, seeing patients via telemedicine while supporting her mother through the increasingly intense media scrutiny. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in November. Grace wore her burgundy dress again, her armor of dignity. Maria sat beside her in the courtroom, holding her hand. Charles Crawford sat on her other side, a protective presence. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Former Ashford employees sat together in a show of solidarity. And there, on the other side of the aisle, sat Victoria and Robert Ashford with their team of expensive lawyers. Victoria looked different. Her usual immaculate appearance had frayed. Her designer clothes seemed to hang on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. When her gaze met Grace's, there was no longer anger or superiority, only fear. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The prosecution outlined their case methodically. Evidence was presented. Witnesses were called. Grace watched as the Ashford empire was dissected piece by piece, its rotten foundation exposed for all to see. When Grace was called to testify, she walked to the stand with her head high. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, something she had been doing her entire life. The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Chen, approached with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Williams, can you please state your name and age for the record?" "Grace Williams. I am 68 years old." "And how long did you work for the Ashford family?" 42 years, from 1981 to 3 months ago." "Can you describe the conditions of your employment?" Grace took a breath and began to tell her story, not with bitterness or anger, but with calm, factual precision. She described her wages, her living conditions, the hours she worked. She described watching the Ashford children grow up while barely seeing her own daughter. She described the casual cruelties, the racism so normalized it had become invisible to everyone, except those who suffered it. And then she described that final dinner party, the order to eat on the floor, the moment when something inside her finally said, "No more." The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing, listening with rapt attention. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Gregory Pierce, rose for cross-examination. Grace braced herself. "Mrs. Williams," Pierce began, his tone falsely sympathetic. "Isn't it true that you were bitter about your position in the Ashford household?" "No, sir. You weren't resentful that you remained a domestic worker while the Ashford family prospered?" "I was resentful that I was paid below minimum wage and forced to live in substandard housing while doing the work of 3 people, Grace corrected. "That's not the same as being bitter about honest work." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Williams, you've claimed that Mrs. Ashford ordered you to eat on the floor. Isn't it possible you misunderstood? that she was simply indicating a different eating area? Sir, when someone tells you to eat in the corner by the pantry, on the floor, there's not much room for misunderstanding. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the courtroom. The judge gavelled for silence. Pierce changed tactics. You've presented recordings allegedly made in the Ashford home. Isn't it true that these recordings were made without Mrs. Ashford's knowledge or consent? Yes, sir. Doesn't that make them illegal? Doesn't that make you, in fact, the criminal in this courtroom? Charles Crawford stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The recordings were made in a one-party consent state, and Mrs. Williams, as a resident of the household, had every legal right to record conversations she could naturally overhear. Sustained, the judge ruled. Mr. Pierce, the legality of the recordings has already been established. Move on. Pierce glared but continued. Mrs. Williams, isn't it true that you've benefited substantially from your accusations? That you've received a considerable inheritance from Harold Ashford? I received an inheritance that Mr. Ashford established 23 years ago, long before any accusations were made. The trust was created as recognition for my care during his illness. How convenient, Pierce sneered. A wealthy man dies, leaves you money, and suddenly you have evidence of his daughter's crimes. Some might call that manipulation of a vulnerable elderly person. Grace's voice remained steady, but her words cut like a knife. Mr. Pierce, the only person who manipulated Harold Ashford was his own daughter. I have documentation proving that Victoria moved money out of her father's accounts while he was incapacitated. Would you like me to detail those transactions? Pierce's face reddened. That's not because I can, Grace continued, her calm voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I can tell you the exact dates, amounts, and accounts. I can tell you how Victoria forged her father's signature on documents after his stroke left him unable to write. I can tell you how she convinced doctors to declare him incompetent, so she could take control of his finances. I was there for all of it, Mr. Pierce. The invisible servant, remember? The one no one thought was paying attention. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Pierce stood frozen, realizing too late that he had opened a door he couldn't close. When order was finally restored, the judge looked at Pierce with barely concealed contempt. Do you have any further questions for this witness, counselor? Pierce, ashen-faced, shook his head. No, Your Honor. As Grace stepped down from the witness stand, she passed Victoria's seat. Their eyes met one final time. Victoria's face was streaked with tears, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. Grace felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that Victoria could never again treat another human being the way she had treated Grace and so many others. The hearing continued for another 2 days. More witnesses testified. More evidence was presented. The case against the Ashfords became overwhelming. On the third day, during a recess, Charles Crawford received a message from the defense team. Victoria's lawyers wanted to talk about a plea agreement. They know they can't win, Crawford told Grace. The evidence is too strong. They want to negotiate. Grace sat in a small conference room with Crawford, District Attorney Martinez, and Sarah Chen. What are they offering? Martinez consulted her notes. Victoria pleads guilty to tax fraud, labor violations, and 1 count of elder financial abuse related to her father. Robert pleads guilty to bribery and construction contract fraud. Victoria gets 4 years in prison, Robert gets 3. They forfeit all assets gained through illegal means, which amounts to approximately $12 million. That money will be distributed to victims, including former employees who were underpaid. They're also agreeing to a lifetime ban from operating any business or charitable organization. And if we don't accept, Grace asked, we go to trial. We'll probably win, but it will take a year or more. And Grace, I have to be honest. Trials are unpredictable. With expensive enough lawyers, sometimes people like the Ashfords find ways to slip through cracks in the system. Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking, will the plea agreement be public? Yes. They'll have to allocute in open court, which means they'll have to admit to their crimes in detail. And the workers who came forward, will they be compensated? Every single one. We've identified 47 former employees who were paid below minimum wage or denied proper benefits. They'll all receive restitution. Grace nodded slowly. Then I think we should accept. This was never about making Victoria suffer. It was about justice. If she admits what she did, if the workers are compensated, if she goes to prison and can never hurt anyone else again, that's justice. Martinez smiled with deep respect. Mrs. Williams, you're a remarkable woman. I'm just tired of watching bad people win. Grace repeated the words she'd said weeks ago in Crawford's office. And I'm tired of good people suffering in silence. The plea agreement was accepted. 2 weeks later, Grace sat in the courtroom once more as Victoria and Robert Ashford stood before the judge to allocute. Victoria's voice shook as she admitted to her crimes. I exploited workers who depended on me for their livelihoods. I paid them less than legal wages. I treated them as less than human. Her eyes found Grace in the courtroom. I especially treated Grace Williams with cruelty and disrespect. I am deeply ashamed. The words sounded hollow, rehearsed by lawyers. But they were on the record. They were the truth, spoken aloud in a court of law, unable to be taken back or denied. When the judge sentenced Victoria to 4 years in prison, Grace felt Maria squeeze her hand. All around them, former Ashford employees wiped away tears, not of sadness, but of relief, of vindication, of justice, finally, at long last. As they left the courthouse, reporters surrounded Grace, shouting questions. But this time, Grace stopped and faced the cameras. I want to say something, she announced, and the crowd fell silent. This case was never about one woman's revenge. It was about dignity. It was about the right of every worker to be treated as a human being, regardless of their race or position. It was about standing up to power when power forgets that it exists to serve, not to dominate. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. I know there are people watching this who have been treated the way I was treated. People who are invisible in their own lives. People who are told through words or actions that they don't matter. I want you to know that you do matter. Your dignity cannot be taken from you unless you give it away. And you are not alone. The reporters erupted with follow-up questions, but Maria and Charles Crawford gently guided Grace toward a waiting car. As they drove away from the courthouse, Grace looked back one final time at the building where justice had been served. Mama, Maria said softly, you did it. You really did it. Grace smiled, but she was already thinking ahead. Baby, we're just getting started. What do you mean? All that restitution money? The $12 million being distributed to victims? I've been thinking. Some of those workers won't know what to do with that money. They'll need help managing it, investing it, making it last. And there will be other workers out there still being exploited who need someone to fight for them. Maria stared at her mother with dawning realization. Mama, are you saying what I think you're saying? Grace nodded. Harold Ashford gave me the resources to rest. But I'm not ready to rest yet. I'm ready to work. But this time, on my own terms, for people like me. Charles Crawford, sitting in the front seat, turned around with a wide smile. Mrs. Williams, are you talking about starting an organization? I'm talking about starting a movement, Grace corrected. A legal fund and support network for domestic workers and exploited laborers. A place where people can report abuse without fear. A voice for the invisible. That's going to take a lot of work, Crawford warned, though his eyes shone with excitement. Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy and determination. Mr. Crawford, I've worked hard my whole life. The difference is now I'm working for something I believe in. Now I'm working for us. As the car drove through the city toward her home in Riverside, Grace looked out at the streets with new eyes. Somewhere out there were other women like her, other workers being told they didn't matter, other voices waiting to be heard. Victoria Ashford had tried to make her eat on the floor, to crush her dignity, to render her invisible. Instead, she had awakened something far more powerful, the determination of a woman who had finally realized her own worth, and who was ready to help others realize theirs. The battle had been won, but the war for dignity, respect, and justice was just beginning. and Grace Williams was ready to lead it. 6 months after Victoria Ashford's sentencing, Grace Williams stood in front of a modest 2-story building in the heart of the city's working-class district. The morning sun illuminated the freshly painted sign above the door. The Dignity Project, legal aid and support for domestic workers. Maria stood beside her, holding a box of supplies. Charles Crawford, now Grace's pro bono legal counsel and board member, carried another. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered, former Ashford employees, church members, local reporters, and curious neighbors. "Mama," Maria whispered, "are you ready?" Grace looked at the building, purchased with a portion of her inheritance and renovated by volunteer labor, and smiled. "I've been ready my whole life, baby. I just didn't know it." She unlocked the doors, and the crowd followed her inside. The space was simple but welcoming. Comfortable chairs in the waiting area, private consultation rooms, a small library of legal resources, and offices for the staff Grace had carefully assembled over the past months. Pastor Williams from her church offered a blessing. "Lord, bless this place and the woman who created it. May it be a sanctuary for those who have been made to feel small, a fortress for those who have been denied justice, and a beacon of hope for all who enter seeking dignity." The crowd responded with heartfelt amens. After the blessing, Grace addressed the gathering. "When I walked out of the Ashford mansion, I didn't know what my life would become. I just knew I couldn't stay in that place anymore. But Harold Ashford's gift gave me more than money. It gave me the power to choose, and I choose to use that power to help others find their voice." She gestured to the offices around them. "The Dignity Project will provide free legal consultation for domestic workers and day laborers. We'll help people understand their rights, file complaints against abusive employers, and navigate the legal system. We'll also offer financial literacy classes, job placement assistance, and counseling services." Dorothy Henderson, the woman from the dinner party who had given Grace her card that fateful night, stood up. "Mrs. Williams, I'd like to make a donation to your organization, $500,000 to be exact." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Grace's eyes widened. "Mrs. Henderson, that's incredibly generous, but nothing," Dorothy interrupted gently. "I sat at that table and watched Victoria humiliate you, and I did nothing. I've lived with that shame every day since. I can't change the past, but I can help build a better future. Please accept this." Before Grace could respond, another voice spoke up. "I'd like to contribute as well." It was Mr. Harrison, owner of a local grocery chain, a man Grace had never met. $100,000. "I've employed workers my entire life, and I've seen how some of my competitors treat theirs. This work matters." One by one, people stepped forward with donations large and small. A construction worker who had received restitution from the Ashford case donated $5,000. An elderly woman on a fixed income offered $50. A group of nurses from the local hospital pledged to volunteer their time for the counseling services. By the end of the day, the Dignity Project had received pledges totaling over $1 million, plus commitments from dozens of volunteers. Charles Crawford pulled Grace aside, his eyes bright with emotion. "Grace, do you understand what's happening here? You've started something extraordinary." "We've started something," Grace corrected. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us deciding that the way things have been isn't the way things have to be." The first client arrived on Monday morning. Her name was Rosa Martinez, a 43-year-old woman from El Salvador who had been working as a nanny for a wealthy family. She spoke limited English, and her hands trembled as she sat across from Grace in the consultation room. Through an interpreter, Rosa told her story. She had been promised $12 an hour, but was paid only $6. She worked 70 hours a week with no overtime. The family had confiscated her passport, telling her they would report her to immigration if she complained. When she asked for a day off to attend her daughter's school graduation, she was fired and told she had 24 hours to leave the house. Grace listened, her heart aching with familiar pain. This could have been her story, in a different time, under different circumstances. "Rosa," Grace said through the interpreter, "you have rights. What they did to you is illegal. We're going to help you." Over the following weeks, with Charles Crawford's guidance and the support of volunteer lawyers, they built a case against Rosa's former employers. They recovered her passport, calculated her back wages with overtime, and filed complaints with the labor board and immigration authorities. The process was slow and frustrating. The family's lawyers tried every tactic to delay and discourage. But Grace had learned something important from her own experience. Perseverance, paired with good legal representation, could overcome almost any obstacle. 3 months later, Rosa received a settlement of $48,000 in back wages and damages. She cried in Grace's office, holding her hands and thanking her in broken English. "You gave me my life back," Rosa said. "You gave me my dignity." Grace shook her head gently. "No, Rosa. You always had your dignity. They just tried to take it from you. I simply helped you prove it was yours all along." Rosa's case became the first of many. Word spread through the immigrant community, through domestic worker networks, through the invisible channels where exploited laborers share information. Within 6 months, the Dignity Project had helped over 200 workers recover wages, report abuse, and find safer employment. But Grace knew that legal services alone weren't enough. Many of the workers who came to her were trapped in cycles of poverty that made them vulnerable to exploitation. They needed education, skills training, and support networks. She expanded the Dignity Project services. Maria, using her medical expertise, organized free health clinics every Saturday. Local teachers volunteered to offer English classes and GED preparation. A retired accountant taught financial literacy. A group of successful businesswomen offered mentorship and job placement assistance. The building on the corner, once quiet and overlooked, became a hub of activity. On any given day, you might find Grace helping someone fill out legal forms, Maria checking blood pressure, or volunteers teaching computer skills. The local news ran a feature story, "From Maid to Movement Leader: How Grace Williams is Changing Lives." The reporter interviewed several workers who had been helped by the Dignity Project, and their stories were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. National media picked up the story. Grace was invited to speak at conferences, to appear on talk shows, to write articles about workers' rights. She accepted some invitations and declined others, always conscious of staying focused on the work rather than her own fame. One speaking engagement, however, she couldn't refuse. The National Domestic Workers Alliance invited her to keynote their annual convention. Grace stood before an audience of 3,000 workers, mostly women of color, and shared her story. "I spent 42 years being invisible," she told them. "But invisible doesn't mean powerless. Every one of you has power. The power to say no. The power to demand respect. The power to stand up for yourself and for each other." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Afterward, dozens of workers approached her with their own stories, their own dreams of creating similar organizations in their communities. Grace realized her vision was expanding beyond a single office in a single city. She began working with Charles Crawford to develop a franchise model, a way for other communities to establish their own dignity projects with support, training, and resources from the original. Within a year, Dignity Project offices had opened in 5 other cities. Within 2 years, there were 12. Each office was run by someone who had experienced exploitation firsthand, someone who understood viscerally the need for these services. Grace traveled to each opening, offering guidance and inspiration. But she always returned home to Riverside, to the small house that represented her freedom, to the community that had embraced her. Her life had found a rhythm. Mornings at the Dignity Project office, afternoons handling administrative work or meeting with donors, evenings at home with whatever family or friends stopped by, Sunday mornings at church, where she now served on the board of deacons, Tuesday nights at a book club she'd joined, discussing literature with women who had become genuine friends. It was, Grace often reflected, the life she had dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. One afternoon, as Grace was reviewing case files, her receptionist buzzed the intercom. "Mrs. Williams, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." "Send her in," Grace said, expecting another worker seeking help. The door opened and Grace's breath caught in her throat. Standing there, looking years older and utterly broken, was Victoria Ashford. Victoria had been released from prison 2 weeks earlier after serving her 4-year sentence. She wore plain clothes, her once perfect hair now streaked with gray and simply styled. Prison had stripped away her veneer of wealth and superiority, leaving behind something more human, more vulnerable. "Mrs. Williams?" Victoria's voice was barely audible. "I know I have no right to be here. I know you owe me nothing, but I need to speak with you." Grace's first instinct was to refuse, to send this woman away. Maria, who had been working in the next office and heard Victoria's voice, appeared in the doorway with a protective expression. But Grace, remembering her own words about dignity and redemption, gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." Maria looked at her mother with concern, but Grace shook her head slightly. "It's okay, baby. Give us a few minutes." Reluctantly, Maria left, though she kept the door slightly open. Victoria sat, her hands folded in her lap, unable to meet Grace's eyes. "I don't know where to start. The beginning is usually a good place." Victoria took a shaky breath. "Prison changes you. It strips away everything you thought made you special. In there, I was nobody. Just another inmate. The guards didn't care about my family name or my money. The other inmates certainly didn't. I was assigned to the laundry, working 12 hours a day, paid pennies. I slept in a cell barely big enough to turn around in. I ate food that was barely edible." She finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I lived your life, Mrs. Williams. I lived the life I forced you to live for 42 years, and it nearly destroyed me in 4. Grace said nothing, waiting. "I wrote you letters," Victoria continued. "Dozens of them, but I never sent them because words felt so inadequate. How do you apologize for treating someone as less than human? How do you apologize for decades of cruelty and exploitation?" "You can't," Grace said quietly. "Some things are too big for apologies." Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, but I had to come here and face you. I had to tell you that you were right. About everything. About dignity. About respect. About justice. I fought against admitting it for so long, even after the trial, even after prison. But I can't fight it anymore." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn piece of paper. "This is a list of every person I can remember exploiting or treating poorly. Workers, business partners, even friends. It's not complete. I know there are people I've forgotten or never knew I hurt, but I've been working through this list trying to make amends where I can." Grace took the paper, scanning the names. There were dozens, some she recognized, many she didn't. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Victoria said. "I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that you changed my life. Not by destroying it, though that's what I told myself at first. You changed it by showing me what a life of integrity looks like. Even in your anger, even in your testimony against me, you never stooped to cruelty. You never tried to humiliate me the way I humiliated you. You simply told the truth." Grace set the paper down. "Victoria, why are you really here?" Victoria met her eyes. "Because I want to help. I know you probably don't want anything from me, and I understand if you say no. But I have time now, and I have experience in fundraising and organization. I could volunteer, do administrative work, anything that would be useful. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to undo some of the harm I've caused." Grace studied the woman before her. Victoria looked sincere, truly humbled by her experience. But Grace had learned to be cautious, to verify intentions through actions rather than words. "I'll think about it," Grace said finally. "Give me your contact information. If I decide there's a place for you here, I'll call you." Victoria nodded, writing down her phone number with trembling hands. "Thank you for even considering it. I know it's more than I deserve." As Victoria stood to leave, Grace spoke again. "Victoria, there's something you should understand. If you work here, you won't be special. You won't be in charge. You'll be just another volunteer taking direction from me and my staff. Can you handle that?" Victoria's answer was immediate. Yes, that's exactly what I need. After Victoria left, Maria came back into the office. Mama, please tell me you're not seriously thinking about letting that woman work here. Grace smiled at her daughter's protectiveness. Baby, this organization is about redemption as much as justice. If Victoria is sincere about changing, who am I to deny her that chance? She treated you like dirt for 42 years. I know, and she paid the price for it. The question is, do we believe people can change, or don't we? Because if we don't, then what's the point of all this work we're doing? Maria sat down, still skeptical. So what are you going to do? I'm going to wait. If she's serious, she'll call back. She'll persist. And if she does, we'll start her with the smallest tasks and see how she handles them. Not because she deserves a chance, but because everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were. 2 days later, Victoria called. And the day after that. And the day after that. Each time she simply asked if Grace had made a decision, never pushy, always respectful. Finally, Grace called her back. Be here Monday morning at 8 o'clock. You'll be sorting donations and doing data entry. Minimum wage, same as all our volunteers earn for their time. Thank you. Victoria's voice broke. Thank you so much. Victoria's first day was awkward. The other staff and volunteers knew who she was, knew what she had done. They watched her with suspicion and hostility. But Victoria kept her head down, worked diligently, and never complained, even when given the most menial tasks. Grace observed from a distance. She saw Victoria organizing donations with meticulous care, saw her staying late to finish data entry projects, saw her listening to the stories of the workers who came through the doors seeking help. After 2 weeks, one of the staff members approached Grace. I hate to admit this, but Victoria is actually a good worker. She's organized the entire donation storage system in a way that makes everything more accessible. She ran a household and multiple businesses for decades, Grace replied. She has skills. The question was whether she'd be willing to use them humbly. Another month passed. Victoria continued showing up every day, doing whatever was asked of her without complaint. Grace noticed changes in her. The way she listened to the workers' stories with genuine empathy. The way she offered help without condescension. The way she deferred to the staff's expertise rather than assuming she knew better. One day a domestic worker came in who was clearly in distress, speaking rapidly in Spanish. The usual interpreter was out sick, and the staff was struggling to understand her. Victoria, who no one knew spoke Spanish, stepped forward. May I help? I'm fluent. Grace nodded, curious to see what would happen. Victoria sat with the woman for over an hour, translating her story, helping her fill out forms, explaining her legal options with patience and clarity. When the woman left, she hugged Victoria and thanked her repeatedly. After the woman departed, Victoria turned to Grace with tears in her eyes. Her employer made her sleep in a closet while the family's dog had its own bedroom, and they threatened to have her children taken away if she complained. Now you understand, Grace said quietly. Now you understand what this work really means. Victoria nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Grace called a staff meeting. I want to discuss Victoria Ashford's role here. She's been volunteering for 3 months, and I think it's time we address the situation directly. The staff exchanged glances. Some still looked uncomfortable with Victoria's presence. I know this is complicated, Grace continued. Victoria hurt me, hurt many of us, and we haven't forgotten that. But I've been watching her, and I see genuine change. I see someone who is learning humility and empathy. I see someone who could be a real asset to our mission. Maria spoke up. Mama, are you saying you want to give her a permanent position? I'm saying I want to give her the chance to prove herself, not as a favor to her, but because our mission is to help people reclaim their dignity. That includes people who have lost their dignity through their own actions. One of the other staff members, a woman named Jennifer, who had been exploited by her employer for years, raised her hand. Mrs. Williams, I have to be honest. When Victoria first started volunteering, I wanted her gone. But I've watched her too. She worked with my cousin last week, helped her file a wage claim. My cousin said Victoria was kind and patient. I never thought I'd say this, but I think she deserves a chance. Others nodded in agreement. Not everyone was convinced, but there was a general sense of willingness to try. Grace made the decision. Victoria, effective immediately, you're our volunteer coordinator. You'll oversee other volunteers, manage the donation system, and help with translation services. It's a real position with real responsibilities. Can you handle that? Victoria stood, her face a mixture of gratitude and determination. Yes, I won't let you down. You let me down 42 years ago, Grace said frankly. You let yourself down for most of your life. The question isn't whether you'll let me down again. The question is whether you'll finally live up to your own potential for good. Over the following months, Victoria proved herself. She brought her organizational skills and fundraising experience to the Dignity Project, helping to streamline operations and secure donations. But more importantly, she brought humility and a willingness to learn from the very people she had once looked down upon. The Dignity Project continued to grow. By the end of its second year, it had helped over 1,000 workers recover wages, report abuse, and find better employment. The network of affiliated offices across the country had expanded to 25 cities. The movement Grace had started was becoming a national force for change. Grace was invited to testify before Congress about the need for stronger protections for domestic workers. She stood in that chamber, thinking of all the years she had been voiceless, and spoke with clarity and conviction about the need for federal reform. 6 months later, the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights passed, providing overtime protections, sick leave, and other basic rights to domestic workers across the country. Grace was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. She stood beside the president, a simple woman from humble beginnings who had changed the law of the land. But the moment that meant the most to Grace came on a quiet Tuesday evening at the Dignity Project office. A young woman named Sarah, who had come to them 6 months earlier after escaping an abusive employment situation, stopped by to visit. Mrs. Williams, Sarah said, I wanted you to know that I got my GED. I'm enrolled in community college for the spring semester. I'm going to study nursing. Grace hugged her tightly. I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without this place. Without you believing in me when no one else did. After Sarah left, Grace sat alone in her office, looking at the wall where they had started displaying photos of the workers they had helped. Hundreds of faces, each representing a story of struggle and triumph, each representing a life reclaimed from exploitation. Victoria appeared in the doorway. Over the past year, she and Grace had developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Grace, Victoria said. She had earned the right to use Grace's first name. I wanted to tell you something. I've been meeting with my children, trying to repair those relationships. It's slow, difficult work, but I told them about you, about this place, about what I learned. What did you tell them? I told them that true power isn't about control or domination. It's about service. I told them that dignity isn't something you're born with because of your family name or your bank account. It's something you earn through how you treat others, especially those who can do nothing for you in return. Grace nodded. And how did they respond? My daughter is coming to volunteer next week. My son donated $10,000 to the Dignity Project. It's not much given the wealth they still have, but it's a start. It's more than a start, Grace said. It's the next generation learning to do better. That night, as Grace drove home to Riverside, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the servants' quarters of the Ashford mansion to her own home. From invisibility to influence. From powerlessness to purpose. She thought about Victoria, once her oppressor, now her colleague in the fight for workers' rights. She thought about the thousands of workers who had found help and hope through the Dignity Project. She thought about the changes in law and policy that had resulted from their collective voice. But most of all, she thought about that night when she had been ordered to eat on the floor, and how she had found the courage to say no. That single moment of self-respect had set in motion a chain of events that had changed not just her life, but countless others. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw Maria's car already there. Her daughter had come for their weekly dinner together. Through the window, Grace could see Maria setting the table, preparing food, making their house into a home. Grace sat in her car for a moment longer, looking at that simple scene of domestic comfort, a scene she had provided for others for decades, but had never truly had for herself. Now it was hers. The house was hers. The time was hers. The life was hers. She thought of Harold Ashford's letter. Use this gift to rest, to live, to be seen. She had done all three. But she had done something more. She had used his gift to help others rest, live, and be seen. She had taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. She had taken her humiliation and transformed it into a movement. Grace Williams got out of her car and walked toward her home, toward her daughter, toward the life she had earned through suffering and redeemed through courage. Behind her lay 42 years of service. Ahead lay however many years remained, and she would spend them serving still, but this time on her own terms, for her own reasons, with her own power. The millionaire woman had tried to break her by making her eat on the floor. Instead, she had created a woman who would spend the rest of her life lifting others up. And that, Grace thought as she opened her door to the warmth of her home, was the sweetest victory of all. 5 years after Grace Williams walked out of the Ashford mansion, she stood on a stage at the city's largest conference center. The banner behind her read, "5th Annual Dignity Project National Conference, celebrating 5 years of justice, 5 years of change." The auditorium was filled to capacity with over 2,000 people. Domestic workers, labor organizers, lawyers, activists, politicians, and donors who had supported the movement. Grace, now 73 years old, moved a bit slower than she once had, but her voice remained strong and her eyes bright with purpose. 5 years ago, she began, her words carried by microphones to every corner of the room, I was a woman who had lost hope. I had spent 42 years making myself small, making myself invisible, accepting crumbs from people who should have given me bread. I had convinced myself that this was simply how the world worked, and there was nothing I could do to change it. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, many of them women of color like herself, many of them workers who had lived similar stories. But then something happened that changed everything. I was ordered to eat on the floor like an animal, and something inside me that had been sleeping for decades suddenly woke up. That something was my dignity. And once I remembered I had it, no one could take it away from me again. The audience erupted in applause. Grace waited for it to subside, then continued. Today, the Dignity Project operates in 43 cities across the United States. We have helped over 15,000 workers recover wages, report abuse, and reclaim their rights. We have trained 250 volunteer lawyers. We have educated thousands more about their legal protections. And we have changed laws at the local, state, and federal level. More applause, louder this time. Grace smiled but raised her hand for quiet. But numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is in the individual lives that have been transformed. It's in the woman who can now afford to send her daughter to college. It's in the man who no longer works 16-hour days for poverty wages. It's in the child who sees their parent treated with respect and learns that dignity is not negotiable. She gestured to the side of the stage where several people waited. I'd like to introduce you to some of those stories. Rosa Martinez, the first client Grace had helped 5 years ago, walked onto the stage. She was dressed professionally, her confidence evident in every step. 5 years ago, I was terrified, Rosa said in English that had improved dramatically. I had no money, no rights, and no hope. Grace believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Today, I am the director of the Dignity Project's office in Los Angeles. I help workers just like I was helped, and I tell them what Grace told me. You always had your dignity. No one can take it unless you give it away. Next came James Washington, a 60-year-old man who had worked as a driver for wealthy families for 30 years, always underpaid and mistreated. The Dignity Project had helped him recover over $100,000 in back wages. That money changed my life, James said, his deep voice filled with emotion. But it wasn't just the money. It was someone finally saying, "What happened to you was wrong and you deserve justice." It was someone finally seeing me as a human being with rights. I'm retired now, living comfortably for the first time in my life. But more than that, I'm living with respect. One by one, workers took the stage and shared their stories. A nanny who had been separated from her own children for years to care for someone else's. A housekeeper who had been injured on the job and denied medical care. An elderly gardener who had worked without a single day off for over a decade. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: exploitation, invisibility, and finally, through the Dignity Project, justice and restoration. When the last testimony was finished, Grace returned to the microphone. These are the faces of our movement. These are the voices that were silenced for so long and are now being heard. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't give these people their dignity. They always had it. I simply helped them remember it and then helped them fight for it. She looked toward the back of the auditorium, where Victoria Ashford sat quietly. Over the past 5 years, Victoria had become an integral part of the Dignity Project's leadership. She now managed the National Volunteer Program, traveled to new cities to help establish offices, and used her fundraising expertise to secure major donations. But she always remained humble, always remembering where she had come from. 5 years ago, Grace continued, if someone had told me that my former employer, the woman who had ordered me to eat on the floor, would become one of my most trusted colleagues in this work, I would have said they were crazy. But transformation is real. Redemption is possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. She gestured for Victoria to join her on stage. Victoria hesitated, uncomfortable with public recognition, but Grace insisted. Victoria walked to the stage and the two women stood side by side. Victoria and I will never be friends in the traditional sense, Grace said honestly. The wounds are too deep, the history too painful. But we have become something more important than friends. We have become partners in a shared mission. She has used her privilege, her education, her connections, all the things that once made her my oppressor, to become an advocate for workers' rights. Victoria took the microphone, her voice trembling slightly. I don't deserve to be on this stage. I don't deserve Grace's generosity or your acceptance, but I'm deeply grateful for both. Every day I work at the Dignity Project, I remember the person I was and I commit to being better. I can never undo the harm I caused, but I can spend the rest of my life preventing others from causing similar harm. She turned to Grace. You taught me that dignity isn't about where you were born or how much money you have. It's about how you treat people, especially those who have less power than you. That's a lesson I learned too late, but I'm trying to live it now. The audience, many of whom had been skeptical of Victoria's involvement when they first learned of it, applauded. Not everyone was convinced. Not everyone had forgiven. But most recognized the value of genuine transformation. After the conference, Grace held a private reception for major donors and partners. Charles Crawford, now in his late 70s, approached with his usual warm smile. Grace, I have something to tell you. I'm retiring from active practice next month, but I wanted to make sure the Dignity Project's legal foundation was secure first. I've established an endowment of $5 million to fund your legal services in perpetuity. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Charles, that's beyond generous. It's an investment in justice, he replied. Besides, you've taught me more about the law than I learned in 40 years of practice. Real law isn't just about statutes and precedents. It's about ensuring every person, regardless of their station in life, has access to justice. You embody that principle. Dorothy Henderson, now in her 80s, approached next. Grace, dear, I wanted you to know that I've updated my will. Upon my passing, my entire estate will go to the Dignity Project. It's approximately $20 million. Grace was stunned. Dorothy, your family... My family has more than enough, Dorothy interrupted gently. And honestly, they don't deserve it. They're good people, but they've never understood the importance of this work the way I do. Every day I regret not standing up for you that night. This is my way of standing up now, even if I won't be here to see it. Grace embraced the older woman. You've already stood up, Dorothy. You've been standing up for 5 years. This is just the next step. As the reception continued, Maria pulled her mother aside. Mama, I have news. Big news. Grace looked at her daughter's glowing face and knew immediately. You're pregnant. Maria laughed. How did you know? Mother's intuition. Oh, baby, I'm so happy for you. They held each other, crying happy tears. Maria's husband, a kind pediatrician named David, whom she had married 2 years earlier, joined them. We want to name her Grace, Maria said. If it's a girl, Grace Elizabeth after you and Grandma. Grace's heart swelled. Your grandmother would have been so proud of you, of all of this. That evening, as Grace returned to her home in Riverside, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She walked through her house, touching the furniture she had chosen, looking at the photos on the walls. Pictures of Maria's wedding, of Dignity Project celebrations, of workers whose lives had been changed. She went to her bedroom and opened the drawer where she kept her most precious possessions: Harold Ashford's letter, the deed to her house, photographs of her late husband Samuel, and a new addition, a letter from the President of the United States, thanking her for her advocacy work and her role in passing the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. Grace sat on her bed, in her house, and allowed herself a moment of pure gratitude. Not gratitude for what had been done to her, but gratitude for what she had been able to do with the strength she discovered in her darkest moment. Her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something prompted her to answer. Mrs. Williams? My name is Carmen Rodriguez. I got your number from Rosa Martinez. I'm a domestic worker in Miami, and my employer, she made me. The woman's voice broke. Take your breath, Carmen. Grace said gently. I'm listening. Tell me what happened. For the next hour, Grace listened to Carmen's story, a story that echoed her own in painful ways. An employer who treated her as less than human, wages withheld, dignity denied. And finally, a moment of courage when Carmen decided she deserved better. Carmen, I'm going to connect you with our Miami office. They'll help you, just like I was helped. You're not alone anymore. Do you hear me? You're not alone. After they hung up, Grace sat in the quiet of her bedroom. 5 years, 43 cities, 15,000 workers helped, and still the calls came. Still the stories of exploitation continued. The work was far from over. But Grace was no longer afraid of the work. She understood now that this was her calling, the purpose that had been waiting for her all along, hidden beneath decades of servitude. The next morning, Grace woke early and drove to the original Dignity Project office. She arrived before anyone else, as she often did, and sat in the quiet building surrounded by the files of workers they had helped, the photos of victories won, the certificates and awards they had received. She heard the door open. Victoria entered carrying coffee and breakfast pastries as she did every morning. Morning, Grace, Victoria said, setting down the coffee. Big day today. We're interviewing candidates for the Boston office director position. Did you review the applications? I did. There's a woman named Patricia Chen who looks promising. Former hotel housekeeper, put herself through law school at night, passionate about workers' rights. Grace smiled. That's exactly the kind of person we need. Someone who lived it. They worked together for the next hour, preparing for the day's meetings. It was a routine they had developed over the years. A partnership built not on friendship, but on mutual respect and shared commitment. At one point, Victoria paused and looked at Grace. Do you ever regret it? Taking that money, starting all this? You could have just retired, lived quietly, enjoyed your final years in peace. Grace considered the question. No, she said finally. Peace without purpose is just comfortable emptiness. I had 68 years of being comfortable with my own oppression. I don't want to be comfortable anymore. I want to be useful. You're more than useful, Grace. You're essential. You've changed the world. Not the world, Grace corrected gently. Just a corner of it. Just enough to make life a little better for people like us. That afternoon, they interviewed Patricia Chen, who turned out to be everything her application suggested and more. She shared her own story of exploitation, of working 3 jobs while studying law, of watching her mother work herself to death as a domestic worker with no rights or protections. "I want to be part of this," Patricia said, tears in her eyes. "I want to be part of making sure what happened to my mother doesn't happen to anyone else." Grace hired her on the spot. As the day ended and the office emptied, Grace stood at the window overlooking the street. She watched workers heading home from their jobs, nannies pushing strollers, housekeepers carrying cleaning supplies, drivers waiting at bus stops. Each one a person with hopes and dreams. Each one deserving of dignity and respect. Her phone buzzed. A text from Maria. "Just left the doctor. It's definitely a girl. Baby Grace is healthy and strong. Due in 6 months. I love you, Mama." Grace smiled, imagining her granddaughter growing up in a world that was at least a little bit better than the one she had known. A world where the Dignity Project existed, where workers had rights, where voices could not be so easily silenced. She thought about the dinner party 5 years ago, about the moment Victoria had ordered her to eat on the floor. That moment had been designed to break her, to remind her of her place, to crush whatever remained of her spirit. Instead, it had awakened something fierce and unbreakable. It had reminded her that she was more than her job, more than her poverty, more than the sum of her struggles. She was a human being with inherent worth, and that worth could not be diminished by anyone else's cruelty. Victoria appeared beside her at the window. "What are you thinking about?" "That night," Grace said. "The dinner party." Victoria flinched. Even after 5 years of redemption work, the memory still caused her pain. "I wish I could go back and change it." "I don't," Grace said, surprising even herself with the truth of it. "If you hadn't done that, I might have stayed in that house until I died. I might have accepted that life as all I deserved. Your cruelty, terrible as it was, forced me to finally choose myself." "I don't know if that makes it better or worse," Victoria said quietly. "It makes it what it was. A turning point. Not the one either of us planned, but the one we both needed. You needed to lose everything to find your humanity. I needed to lose everything to find my power." They stood together in silence, watching the workers pass by below, each one a reminder of why they did this work, why they would continue doing it for as long as they were able. 3 months later, Grace received an invitation that brought her to tears. The mayor's office was establishing a new award, the Grace Williams Award for Advocacy and Justice, to be given annually to someone who had made significant contributions to workers' rights and social justice. "But I'm not dead yet," Grace protested to Charles Crawford when he told her. "Don't they usually wait until you're gone to name things after you?" Crawford laughed. "They want you to be there when they give out the first one. They want you to see the legacy you've created while you're still here to appreciate it." The award ceremony was held at City Hall. The first recipient was Rosa Martinez, Grace's first client, who had spent 5 years building the Dignity Project's Los Angeles office into a powerhouse of advocacy. Rosa accepted the award with tears streaming down her face. "5 years ago, Grace Williams saved my life, not by giving me money or finding me a job, but by showing me that I deserved better." That simple act of recognition changed everything. Today I accept this award not for myself, but for every worker who has ever been made to feel invisible, and for the woman who taught us all to be seen. As the audience applauded, Grace found herself overwhelmed with emotion. This was her legacy, not awards or recognition, but the ripple effect of courage spreading outward, touching lives she would never personally meet, creating change she might never personally witness. After the ceremony, a young reporter approached Grace for an interview. The reporter was barely 25, earnest and idealistic. "Mrs. Williams, what advice would you give to people who are facing exploitation and discrimination today?" Grace thought carefully before answering. "I would tell them that dignity is not something someone else can give you or take away. It's yours. It always has been. The hard part is remembering that when the whole world seems designed to make you forget." And what about people in positions of power? People like Victoria Ashford was. I would tell them to look at the people they employ, the people they have power over, and see them. Really see them. Recognize their humanity. Because the moment you forget someone else's humanity, you begin to lose your own. The reporter scribbled notes. One final question. If you could go back to that night, to the dinner party, knowing everything that would happen afterward, would you change anything? Grace smiled, a deep smile that came from a place of hard-won peace. I would stand up sooner. I would walk away with my head held high, just as I did. But I would do it without the 42 years of waiting. That's what I hope for others, that they won't wait as long as I did to claim their own worth. 6 months later, Grace held her granddaughter for the first time. Baby Grace Elizabeth was born healthy and strong, with her mother's intelligence and her grandmother's spirit. As Grace rocked the baby in her arms, she whispered to her, "You're going to grow up in a world that's still not perfect, sweet girl. There will still be people who try to make you feel small, who try to deny your dignity. But you'll have something I didn't have for most of my life. You'll have proof that change is possible. You'll have the story of your grandmother who refused to eat on the floor, and in that refusal, changed the world just enough to make it a little bit better for you." Maria, exhausted but glowing, watched her mother with her daughter. "Mama, I want her to know your story. All of it. The pain, the struggle, but also the courage and the transformation. I want her to grow up knowing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." "We're not extraordinary, baby," Grace said softly. "We're just unwilling to accept injustice as the price of survival. That's all it takes. That unwillingness, combined with action." As the years continued to pass, the Dignity Project became a permanent fixture in the American landscape of workers' rights organizations. Grace gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, taking on more of an advisory role while younger leaders like Rosa and Patricia carried the work forward. She spent more time with Maria and little Grace Elizabeth, teaching her granddaughter to read, taking her to the park, showing her what a life of purpose looked like. She also spent time writing, working on a memoir that would tell her story in her own words. The title came to her one evening, Rising from the Floor, a memoir of dignity, justice, and transformation. Victoria, who had become Grace's unlikely editor, read each chapter as it was completed. One day she set down a particularly painful chapter about the years of exploitation and looked at Grace with raw emotion. "Grace, I need to ask you something I've been afraid to ask for years. Do you forgive me?" Grace set down her tea and looked at the woman who had once been her oppressor, who had spent 5 years trying to become better. "Victoria, forgiveness isn't something I can give you like a gift. It's something you earn through changed behavior. And you have changed. You've spent 5 years working tirelessly for the people you once exploited. You've used your privilege to elevate others instead of dominating them. So yes, I suppose I do forgive you. But more importantly, I respect you now. That's worth more than forgiveness." Victoria wept, the kind of deep, cleansing tears that come from years of carried guilt finally being released. On Grace's 78th birthday, the Dignity Project threw a celebration at the original office. Workers from across the country sent video messages. Lawmakers credited her with changing national policy. Young activists called her their inspiration. But the moment that touched Grace most deeply came when a group of elderly domestic workers, all in their 60s and 70s, stood together and sang a hymn they had written in her honor. The lyrics spoke of invisible hands that built the world, of voices finally heard, of dignity reclaimed. As Grace listened, she thought of all the workers who had come before her, who had suffered in silence because they had no other choice. She thought of her own mother, who had worked as a domestic servant her entire life and died without ever experiencing justice. She thought of Samuel, her late husband, who had driven for wealthy families and been treated as less than human. This work, she realized, was for them as much as for anyone. It was a way of honoring their struggles by ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to endure the same indignities. That night, lying in her bed in the house that Harold Ashford's gift had made possible, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her work was done, the work would never be fully done, but because she had lived to see real change, had contributed to that change, had transformed her own pain into purpose. She thought about that moment 5 years ago when Victoria had ordered her to eat on the floor. She thought about how that single moment of cruelty had set in motion a chain of events that had changed thousands of lives. In a strange way, she felt something almost like gratitude. Not for the cruelty itself, but for the awakening it had triggered. For the reminder that she deserved better, that she had power, that her dignity was hers to claim. Victoria had tried to break her by forcing her to her knees. Instead, she had taught her how to stand. And Grace had been standing ever since, not just for herself, but for every worker who had ever been made to feel small, every voice that had been silenced, every person whose humanity had been denied. She closed her eyes, surrounded by the peace of her own home, the security of her independence, the satisfaction of a life well lived. Tomorrow she would wake up and continue the work. There would be more calls from workers needing help, more offices to open, more battles to fight. But tonight she would rest, knowing that she had taken her pain and transformed it into something beautiful. She had taken her humiliation and turned it into a movement. She had taken one woman's cruelty and used it as fuel to create justice for thousands. The millionaire woman had ordered her to eat on the floor, thinking she could crush her spirit and remind her of her place. Instead, Grace Williams had risen from that floor and built an empire of dignity that would outlast them both. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not revenge, not punishment, but the transformation of suffering into service, of pain into purpose, of one woman's courage into a legacy of justice that would echo through generations. Grace Williams had spent 42 years being invisible. She would spend the rest of her life making sure no one else had to disappear. That was her promise to herself, to her granddaughter, and to every worker who would come after her. And it was a promise she would keep. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to never miss stories of courage and justice. Like if you believe dignity matters. Share to inspire someone who needs hope today. Your voice counts.